There is something about the night that invites reflection, a quietness that settles over the world when the noise of the day finally fades. And in that quietness, there is space for thoughts to slow down, to drift, to find their way back to what matters beneath all the rushing and striving. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius knew this quietness well, not because his life was peaceful. It was filled with war, plague, political intrigue, and the weight of an empire, but because he learned to carry a kind of stillness within himself, a calm that existed beneath the surface of all that chaos, a philosophical center that held steady no matter what storms gathered around him. His meditations, written in the solitude of military camps and late-night hours, were not grand proclamations meant for public consumption, but private reminders to himself, gentle repetitions of the principles that kept his mind clear and his heart at peace. They were, in many ways, a form of philosophical self-care, a practice of returning again and again to certain truths that anchored him when everything else was uncertain. And these truths, these Stoic principles about control and acceptance and the nature of reality, they remain as relevant now as they were then, perhaps even more so in a world that often feels overwhelming, constantly demanding our attention, our reaction, our participation in endless cycles of worry and distraction. When we speak of inner calm, we are not speaking of the absence of difficulty or challenge, not the elimination of all external disturbance, but rather a quality of mind that remains undisturbed regardless of external circumstances, a steadiness that comes from understanding what is within our power and what is not, what we can influence and what we must simply accept. Marcus Aurelius returned to this distinction constantly in his writing, reminding himself that the only true domain of our control is our own mind, our own perceptions, our judgments and responses, while everything else, the actions of others, the unfolding of events, the rise and fall of fortune, exists beyond our grasp, flowing according to its own nature. This recognition, simple as it sounds, transforms the way we relate to life's challenges, because once we understand that we cannot control the external world, but only our internal response to it, we stop wasting energy fighting against what cannot be changed, and instead direct that energy toward cultivating wisdom, patience, and equanimity. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control, the fundamental division between what depends on us and what does not, and Marcus Aurelius lived by this principle, using it as a daily practice to maintain his inner peace, even while governing an empire that was constantly threatened by external enemies and internal instability. In the stillness of night, when the mind naturally slows and thoughts become more reflective, there is something profoundly comforting about considering these ancient ideas, not as demanding lessons that require immediate action, but as gentle companions that sit beside us, reminding us that peace is always available if we know where to look for it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the universe is change, that life is opinion, meaning that while external circumstances constantly shift and transform, our experience of those circumstances depends entirely on how we choose to perceive and interpret them. Two people can face the same situation, the same loss, the same disappointment, the same unexpected turn of events, and one will be destroyed by it while the other remains calm, not because their external circumstances differ, but because their internal perspective differs, because one has cultivated a philosophy that allows them to meet difficulty with acceptance, while the other has not. This is not about suppressing emotion or pretending that hardship doesn't hurt, but about developing a deeper understanding of what we can reasonably expect from life. and from ourselves. A realistic philosophy that acknowledges difficulty while refusing to be overwhelmed by it. The emperor often reminded himself that what disturbs people is not events themselves, but their judgments about those events, a principle he borrowed from the earlier Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who had taught that we are disturbed not by things, but by the views we take of them. This idea, which might seem abstract at first, becomes powerfully practical when we begin to apply it to our daily experience, noticing how much of our suffering comes not from what actually happens, but from our interpretation of what happens, from the stories we tell ourselves about what things mean, from our insistence that reality should be different than it is. When something unexpected occurs, a plan falls through, a relationship changes, health declines, circumstances shift, our first instinct is often to resist, to wish things were otherwise, to struggle against the reality of what is. But this resistance, this mental fighting against what has already happened, creates a kind of internal friction that exhausts us, wearing us down, not because the external event itself is so terrible, but because we are constantly expending energy trying to mentally undo what cannot be undone. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply, and his meditations are filled with reminders to accept reality as it is, to stop arguing with fate, to recognize that everything that happens is part of the natural unfolding of the universe, and therefore, in a sense, exactly as it should be. This acceptance does not mean passive resignation or indifference to suffering, but rather a clear-eyed acknowledgement of reality that frees us to respond skillfully rather than reactively, to act with wisdom rather than desperation. When we accept that something has happened, truly accept it, without mental reservation or wishful thinking, we stop wasting energy on futile resistance and can instead direct our attention toward what can be done now, in this present moment, with the situation as it actually exists. The Stoics practiced this kind of acceptance not because they lacked ambition or drive, but because they understood that fighting against reality is the surest path to misery, while accepting reality is the foundation of effective action. Marcus Aurelius, even as he led armies and made crucial decisions that affected millions of lives, maintained this fundamental acceptance, this deep trust that whatever happens is part of the natural order, and that his role is not to control outcomes, but to act virtuously within whatever circumstances arise. The night offers us a natural opportunity to practice this kind of acceptance, to let go of the day's struggles and disappointments, to release our grip on all the things we cannot control and simply rest in the awareness that we did what we could, that tomorrow will bring its own challenges and opportunities, and that for now, in this moment, there is nothing that requires our urgent attention or anxious planning. This is one of the gifts of engaging with Stoic philosophy as a nighttime practice. It helps us set down the burdens we've been carrying, not by solving every problem or resolving every concern, but by recognizing which burdens are truly ours to carry and which we've been needlessly shouldering through misguided effort to control what cannot be controlled. Marcus Aurelius would often remind himself at the end of the day that he had done his duty, that he had acted according to his principles, and that the outcomes of his actions were now beyond his control, flowing into the vast network of cause and effect that governs all events. This recognition allowed him to sleep peacefully, not because every problem was solved, but because he understood that peace does not depend on external resolution, but on internal clarity about what is ours to manage and what is not. There is a profound simplicity to this Stoic approach, a simplicity that can feel almost revolutionary in its contrast to the complexity and anxiety of modern life, where we are constantly encouraged to worry about countless things, to feel responsible for outcomes we cannot truly control, to maintain a perpetual state of readiness and concern. But Marcus Aurelius, from his position at the height of Roman power, chose a different path, one that recognized the severe limits of human control, even when that control seemed at its maximum. He knew that he could not control whether his armies would be victorious, whether plague would ravage his cities, whether the Senate would cooperate with his policies, or whether his own health would hold. All of these things depended on countless factors beyond his influence: the decisions of others, the workings of nature, the accumulated causes stretching back through time. What he could control, always and entirely, was his own mind, his judgments, his intentions, his responses, his inner state. And so he focused his philosophical practice on cultivating wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline, the four cardinal virtues of Stoic philosophy, knowing that if he maintained these inner qualities, he would remain fundamentally whole and at peace, regardless of external circumstances. This focus on internal rather than external goods represents one of the most distinctive and valuable aspects of Stoic philosophy, because it places our happiness and peace of mind entirely within our own power, rather than at the mercy of external fortune. Most people place their happiness in things they cannot control: other people's opinions, social status, wealth, health, success. And as a result, they live in a constant state of anxiety, always vulnerable to loss, always dependent on factors beyond their influence. But the Stoics taught that true happiness, which they called eudaimonia or flourishing, comes from virtue alone, from the development of wisdom and good character. And these internal goods can never be taken away by external circumstances. A wise and virtuous person remains fundamentally happy even in adversity, not because they enjoy suffering, but because their happiness does not depend on the absence of suffering, but on the presence of virtue, on living in accordance with reason and nature regardless of circumstances. Marcus Aurelius exemplified this principle, maintaining his philosophical practice and inner calm even while dealing with wars, political crises, personal losses, and eventually his own declining health and approaching death. In the quiet hours before sleep, these ideas begin to settle into our consciousness, not as intellectual abstractions, but as lived possibilities, as invitations to experience life differently, to find peace not by changing our circumstances, but by changing our relationship to our circumstances. This is the promise of Stoic philosophy, that inner calm is always available, always accessible, not as a distant goal requiring perfect conditions, but as a present possibility requiring only a shift in perspective, a willingness to see things as they are rather than as we wish they were, and a commitment to focus our energy on what we can actually control. Marcus Aurelius's meditations return again and again to these themes, circling around the same fundamental insights from different angles, not because he forgot what he had already written, but because these truths require constant repetition, constant reinforcement, constant return. The mind naturally drifts back into old patterns of resistance and anxiety, and so we need reminders, gentle repetitions that call us back to what we know but so easily forget in the pressure of daily life. The emperor wrote that the universe is transformation, life is opinion, and in these simple phrases lies a complete philosophy of acceptance, awareness and inner freedom. If the universe is transformation, then change is not something that occasionally disrupts our life, but the very nature of existence itself, the fundamental reality within which all events unfold. Nothing remains static. Everything flows and alters and eventually dissolves back into the elements from which it emerged. This recognition, far from being depressing, can actually be liberating, because once we accept that change is inevitable and constant, we stop expecting permanence, stop clinging to circumstances or relationships or states of being as if they could last forever, and instead learn to appreciate what is present while it is present, knowing that it will change, knowing that everything changes, and finding peace in that recognition rather than resistance. And if life is opinion, if our experience of life depends fundamentally on our judgments and interpretations, then we possess far more control over our experience than we usually realize. Because while we cannot control events, we can cultivate awareness of our judgments and learn to question them, to examine whether they are helping or harming us, whether they reflect reality or merely our habitual patterns of interpretation. These philosophical practices that Marcus Aurelius developed for himself, these private reminders and self-examinations, they were not meant to be impressive or eloquent, but simply useful, practical tools for maintaining sanity and virtue in challenging circumstances. He wrote in Greek, the language of philosophy, even though Latin was his native tongue, perhaps because Greek gave him access to a richer philosophical vocabulary, or perhaps because writing in Greek created a kind of distance that made self-examination easier, less emotionally charged. His meditations were organized not as a systematic treatise, but as a collection of observations, reminders and reflections, sometimes repeating the same ideas in slightly different words, sometimes exploring new angles on familiar themes, always returning to the central questions. How can I maintain my inner freedom? How can I live in accordance with nature and reason? How can I do my duty without being disturbed by outcomes? How can I accept what happens without losing my commitment to act virtuously? In the stillness that comes with night, when the urgency of the day falls away and the mind naturally becomes more contemplative, we can follow Marcus Aurelius into this space of philosophical reflection, not to solve all our problems or plan all our actions, but simply to remember what matters, to reconnect with the deeper principles that can guide us through difficulty, to find again that place of inner stillness that exists beneath all the surface turbulence of life. This is not an escape from reality, but a deeper engagement with it, a willingness to look clearly at what is and to accept it without the overlay of wishful thinking or catastrophic imagination. The Stoics believed that most of our suffering comes from these mental additions to reality, from judging that something is terrible when it is simply difficult, from catastrophizing about the future when the present is manageable, from carrying resentment about the past when the past cannot be changed. By stripping away these mental additions, by seeing events as they are, rather than through the distorting lens of judgment and expectation, we discover a natural peace that was always there, waiting beneath our anxious thinking. Marcus Aurelius would remind himself, especially in difficult moments, that the present is all we ever have, that the past is gone and the future hasn't arrived, and that therefore all of our living and all of our peace must be found in this present moment, in this current reality, however it appears. This practice of present moment awareness, which has become popular in modern mindfulness traditions, was central to Stoic philosophy long before our contemporary era, because the Stoics understood that the mind's tendency to drift into past regrets and future worries is one of the primary sources of unhappiness. When we are fully present, fully engaged with what is actually happening right now, rather than lost in mental narratives about what happened before or what might happen later, we discover that most moments are actually quite manageable, that the present moment rarely contains the crisis we imagine, and that even when it does contain genuine difficulty, we are usually capable of meeting that difficulty with equanimity if we are not also carrying the weight of past and future in addition to present reality. This practice of returning to the present moment, of gently bringing the mind back when it wanders into anxiety or regret, is not about forced concentration or suppression of thought, but about developing a kind of friendly awareness that notices when we've drifted and kindly redirects our attention. Marcus Aurelius practiced this constantly, noticing when his mind became disturbed and asking himself what judgment was creating that disturbance, what opinion he was holding that was causing suffering, and whether that judgment was necessary or helpful or true. Often he found that his disturbance came from wanting reality to be different than it was, from holding expectations that events had already proven false, from clinging to preferences that circumstances had made impossible. And in recognizing this, in seeing clearly how his own judgments were creating his suffering, he could release those judgments, could let go of his resistance to reality, and could return to a state of acceptance and peace. This process of self-examination and judgment correction is perhaps the most practical aspect of Stoic philosophy because it gives us something concrete to work with, a specific practice we can engage in whenever we notice ourselves becoming disturbed or agitated. Instead of simply suffering through our emotional reactions, we can pause and ask, what am I telling myself about this situation? What judgment am I making? Is this judgment based on reality or on my preferences? Is it helping me respond skillfully or simply adding unnecessary suffering? These questions, which Marcus Aurelius asked himself constantly, open up space between stimulus and response, creating an opportunity for wisdom to emerge rather than automatic reactivity. We cannot always control our first emotional reaction to events, but we can train ourselves to examine that reaction, to question the thoughts that sustain it, and to choose whether to continue feeding it or to let it pass. The night, with its natural stillness and its invitation to rest, provides an ideal time for this kind of gentle self-examination, because we are not in the middle of urgent situations demanding immediate response, but rather in a space of relative peace where we can reflect on the day that has passed, notice our patterns of thinking and reacting, and consider whether there might be a wiser, calmer way to meet whatever tomorrow brings. This is not about harsh self-criticism or perfectionist standards, but about cultivating a kind and curious awareness of our own mental habits, recognizing that we are works in progress, that wisdom develops gradually through repeated practice, and that even Marcus Aurelius, after decades of philosophical study and practice, still needed to remind himself daily of the principles that would keep him centered and calm. If an emperor and philosopher of his caliber required constant repetition and reinforcement of these ideas, we can be gentle with ourselves about our own need for ongoing practice and regular return to foundational truths. One of Marcus Aurelius's most repeated themes is the idea that we should not be surprised or frustrated by the behavior of others, because people act according to their nature and their understanding, and expecting them to act otherwise is as foolish as expecting fire not to burn or water not to be wet. He would remind himself in the morning that he would encounter people who were selfish, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, and resentful, and that this was simply the nature of human society, an inevitable aspect of living among beings who are all struggling with their own ignorance and confusion. But this recognition was not meant to breed cynicism or contempt. Rather, it was meant to prevent disappointment and frustration, to help him maintain his equanimity when faced with difficult people and situations. By expecting difficulty rather than ease, by preparing himself mentally for the challenges that were likely to arise, he avoided the shock and dismay that comes from unrealistic expectations, and he could meet difficult people with patience rather than anger, understanding that they were acting from their own limited understanding rather than from malice directed specifically at him. This practice of managing expectations, of preparing ourselves mentally for difficulty rather than hoping everything will be easy, might seem pessimistic at first glance, but it's actually profoundly practical and conducive to peace. When we expect everything to go smoothly and it doesn't, we experience disappointment and frustration. When we expect challenges and they arise, we're prepared and less reactive. And when we expect difficulty, but things actually go well, we experience pleasant surprise and gratitude. The Stoics weren't pessimists. They didn't believe that everything would be terrible, but they were realistic, understanding that difficulty is a normal part of life and that preparing for it mentally is much wiser than being perpetually surprised and disappointed when it appears. Marcus Aurelius knew that his days would bring difficult decisions, conflicting demands, people who opposed him, and circumstances that didn't cooperate with his plans, and so he prepared himself mentally to meet these challenges with patience and wisdom rather than resistance and complaint. In our own lives, this same principle applies. When we face the day expecting everything to go perfectly according to our preferences, we set ourselves up for frustration and disappointment. But when we acknowledge that difficulties will arise, that plans will sometimes fall through, that people will sometimes disappoint us, and that circumstances will sometimes be challenging, we can meet these realities with greater calm and less reactive suffering. This doesn't mean becoming passive or giving up on positive outcomes, but rather maintaining realistic expectations that allow us to remain steady and resourceful when things don't go as hoped. The peace that comes from this realistic approach is much more durable than the fragile happiness that depends on everything working out perfectly, because it's based on our ability to handle difficulty rather than on the absence of difficulty, on our inner resources rather than on external cooperation. As the night deepens and thoughts slow into a gentler rhythm, these philosophical insights begin to feel less like lessons to be learned and more like truths to be inhabited, perspectives to rest in, rather than ideas to master. Marcus Aurelius's approach to philosophy was never purely intellectual. It was always practical, always aimed at transforming how he lived rather than just what he knew. He studied philosophy not to become a better debater or to impress others with his knowledge, but to become a better person, to develop the wisdom and virtue that would allow him to fulfill his responsibilities with excellence while maintaining his inner freedom and peace. This practical orientation makes Stoic philosophy particularly valuable for those of us who are not professional philosophers, but simply people trying to live good lives amid the complexity and difficulty of ordinary existence. We don't need elaborate theories or abstract arguments. We need practical wisdom that helps us respond to real situations with greater calm, clarity, and virtue. the Stoic understanding of virtue itself is worth dwelling on because it differs in some important ways from how we typically think about morality in the modern world. For the Stoics, virtue wasn't primarily about following rules or avoiding sin, but about developing excellence of character, cultivating wisdom, justice, courage, and self-discipline as fundamental qualities of a well-lived life. These virtues were seen not as arbitrary moral commands, but as expressions of living in accordance with reason and nature, as the natural excellences of a human being fully developed. Wisdom meant seeing reality clearly, understanding what truly matters, and making good judgments. Justice meant treating others fairly and contributing to the common good. Courage meant facing difficulty without being overwhelmed by fear. And self-discipline meant maintaining control over impulses and desires, not through harsh repression, but through rational understanding of what truly serves our well-being. Marcus Aurelius sought to embody these virtues not because he was trying to be perfect or to earn divine favor, but because he understood that virtue is its own reward, that living wisely and justly and courageously leads to a kind of flourishing that doesn't depend on external circumstances. A virtuous person experiences a deep satisfaction that comes from knowing they are living in accordance with their highest nature, that they are being true to themselves, that they are contributing positively to the world around them. This satisfaction, this eudaimonia, is qualitatively different from pleasure or comfort or success. It's a sense of rightness, of alignment, of fulfilling one's purpose as a rational and social being. And because it comes from within, from one's own character and choices, it cannot be taken away by external events, cannot be destroyed by loss or failure or even death. The virtuous person remains fundamentally happy even in adversity, because their happiness is based on who they are rather than on what happens to them. This Stoic emphasis on character over circumstances represents perhaps the philosophy's greatest contribution to human wisdom, because it locates peace and happiness in the one place where we actually have control, in our own minds and hearts, rather than in the vast realm of external events that remain forever beyond our complete influence. We cannot control whether we become wealthy or poor, whether we stay healthy or become ill, whether we succeed in our ambitions or fail, whether we are praised or criticized, whether we live long or die young. All of these things depend on factors outside our control, on fortune, on other people's choices, on the workings of nature. But we can control, or at least significantly influence, whether we develop wisdom, whether we act justly, whether we face fear with courage, whether we maintain self-discipline. These inner goods, these excellences of character, are entirely within our power to cultivate, and they provide a foundation for peace and satisfaction that external fortune cannot shake. Marcus Aurelius lived this philosophy in the most challenging circumstances imaginable, maintaining his inner calm and his commitment to virtue while dealing with constant warfare, devastating plague, political opposition, personal betrayals, and eventually his own failing health and approaching death. He did not have an easy life, despite his position of ultimate power, and his meditations make clear that he struggled at times, that maintaining his philosophical perspective required constant effort and regular return to first principles. But he persevered, and the record of his inner life that he left behind in his private writings has inspired countless readers across the centuries, offering hope that inner peace is possible even in difficulty, that virtue can be maintained even under pressure, and that philosophy is not just an abstract intellectual pursuit. but a practical art of living that can transform how we experience our existence. In the gentle darkness of night, when the world quiets and our own thoughts settle into a slower rhythm, we can touch something of what Marcus Aurelius experienced in his philosophical practice, that sense of stepping back from immediate concerns and viewing life from a broader perspective, seeing our troubles in the context of the vast sweep of time and nature, recognizing our smallness within the larger whole, while also recognizing the profound significance of how we choose to live our brief lives. The Stoics had a practice called the view from above, in which they would imaginatively zoom out from their immediate situation, first seeing themselves in their city, then their city in their country, then their country on the planet, then the planet in the cosmos, gradually expanding their perspective until their personal concerns seemed tiny and temporary within the vastness of space and time. This practice wasn't meant to make their lives seem meaningless, but rather to put their worries into perspective, to help them distinguish what truly matters from what only seems urgent in the moment, to reconnect with the bigger picture when they felt overwhelmed by immediate pressures. This cosmic perspective, this sense of being part of something much larger than our individual concerns, can bring great comfort when we feel burdened by our problems, because it helps us see that what feels overwhelming in the moment is actually quite small and temporary when viewed from a broader perspective. In 100 years, most of what worries us now will be completely forgotten. The things we stress about will have long since resolved or ceased to matter, and new generations will face their own challenges without even knowing ours existed. This recognition doesn't mean our current concerns are unimportant. They matter in the context of our lives and those immediately around us, but it does mean they're not as catastrophically significant as they sometimes feel in the moment of anxiety or stress. Marcus Aurelius would remind himself of the countless people who had lived before him, facing what seemed to them like vital concerns, and how all of those concerns had passed into history, all those lives had ended, all that urgency had dissolved. He would think of famous figures from the past, powerful emperors and philosophers and generals, whose names were now just historical curiosities, whose passionate concerns were completely forgotten, and he would recognize that his own life would eventually pass just as theirs had, that his concerns too would fade into history, and that what mattered was not achieving permanent fame or success, but living virtuously and wisely in whatever time he had. This meditation on impermanence, on the temporary nature of all things, including our own lives, is central to Stoic practice, not because the Stoics were morbid or death-obsessed, but because they understood that accepting impermanence is essential to peace. When we pretend or hope that things will last forever, when we cling to people and circumstances and states of being as if they were permanent, we set ourselves up for suffering, because everything changes, everything passes, everything eventually ends. But when we accept impermanence from the start, when we appreciate things while they're here without demanding that they stay forever, when we hold life lightly, knowing that it will eventually slip from our grasp, we can experience both greater enjoyment of what we have and greater peace when it changes or ends. Marcus Aurelius knew he would die, knew the empire would outlast him, knew that everything he built might eventually crumble, and this knowledge didn't paralyze him or make him nihilistic, but rather freed him to focus on what he could control, living well today, acting virtuously now, fulfilling his responsibilities with excellence in the present moment. This present-centered focus, this emphasis on doing well what is ours to do right now, without worrying excessively about outcomes or legacy, is another key aspect of practical Stoic wisdom. We waste so much energy worrying about how things will turn out, about whether our efforts will succeed, about what people will think of us after we're gone, when all of this is beyond our control and therefore pointless to worry about. What we can control is our effort today, our choices in this moment, our intentions and actions right now. And if we focus our energy there, doing our best with what's in front of us, acting according to our values and principles, we fulfill our responsibility as human beings, regardless of outcomes. The Stoics believed that virtue is sufficient for happiness, meaning that if we act virtuously, we have succeeded in the deepest sense, even if external outcomes don't match our hopes. A virtuous failure is still success in the most important sense, because we have been true to ourselves and our principles, while an unvirtuous success, achieving external goals through dishonest or harmful means, is actually failure regardless of outcomes. This perspective dramatically changes how we evaluate our lives and choices, shifting focus from results to character, from external validation to internal integrity, from what we achieve to who we are. Marcus Aurelius cared deeply about being a good emperor, about fulfilling his responsibilities to Rome and its people, but his primary concern was always being a good person, maintaining his philosophical practice, living according to virtue. He knew that some of his decisions would work out well and others wouldn't, that some problems he faced had no good solutions, that the empire would face challenges beyond his ability to resolve. But none of this disturbed his fundamental peace, because his peace was based on his commitment to virtue rather than on his ability to control outcomes. He did his best, acted according to reason and justice, maintained his integrity even when it would have been easier to compromise, and found satisfaction in that regardless of whether his efforts succeeded in the ways he hoped. As we rest in the quiet of night, allowing these philosophical themes to wash over us gently without forcing understanding or demanding application, we may begin to feel something shift in how we relate to our own lives, a subtle loosening of the grip of anxiety, a gentle recognition that perhaps we've been carrying more than we need to carry, worrying about more than we need to worry about, trying to control more than we can possibly control. The Stoic invitation is simple but profound. Focus on what's yours to manage, your own mind, your own choices, your own character, and release everything else into the vast flow of nature and fate, trusting that the universe unfolds according to its own wisdom, even when we cannot understand its purposes. This is not passive resignation, but active acceptance, not giving up, but giving over what was never ours to control in the first place. Marcus Aurelius found freedom in this acceptance, discovering that the more he released his grip on external outcomes and other people's choices, the more energy he had for what actually mattered: his own philosophical development, his commitment to virtue, his relationships with those he loved, his duties as emperor. He couldn't control whether the Senate supported his policies, but he could control whether he presented those policies with clarity and honesty. He couldn't control whether his armies won battles, but he could control whether he made strategic decisions with wisdom and chose commanders with care. He couldn't control whether people loved or criticized him, but he could control whether he acted with justice and kindness, regardless of their reactions. In every situation, no matter how complex or challenging, there was always something within his control, his own mind and choices, and he learned to focus his energy there rather than dissipating it in futile attempts to control what was beyond his influence. This same principle applies in our own lives, though our circumstances differ vastly from those of a Roman emperor. We cannot control whether we keep our jobs or get promoted, but we can control whether we do our work with integrity and excellence. We cannot control whether our relationships work out as we hope, but we can control whether we treat people with kindness and honesty. We cannot control whether we stay healthy, but we can control whether we take reasonable care of ourselves and accept whatever health challenges arise with grace rather than bitterness. We cannot control whether our plans succeed, but we can control whether we make good plans and adjust thoughtfully when circumstances change. In every situation, there is something within our power and much that is beyond it, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference and directing our energy accordingly. The serenity prayer, used widely in modern recovery programs, echoes this ancient Stoic wisdom. Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. This simple prayer captures the essence of Stoic practice, accepting what we cannot control, taking responsibility for what we can control, and developing the discernment to distinguish between the two. Marcus Aurelius spent his life developing this discernment, this wisdom about what was truly within his power and what only seemed to be, and his meditations are filled with reminders to stay focused on his own sphere of influence rather than becoming disturbed by the countless things beyond it. He knew that if he could maintain this focus, if he could consistently direct his attention and energy toward what was actually his to manage, he would remain fundamentally at peace even while dealing with the most challenging circumstances. In the stillness of nighttime reflection, we can practice this same discernment, gently noticing where our thoughts have been dwelling. Have we been worrying about things we cannot control, replaying conversations we cannot redo, anticipating outcomes we cannot determine? And when we notice this, we can softly redirect our attention to what is actually ours, this present moment, this breath, this opportunity to rest and restore ourselves, this choice about how we hold our experiences, this capacity to accept reality as it is, rather than as we wish it were. These small redirections, repeated patiently over time, gradually train the mind to stay more naturally in its proper domain, to waste less energy on futile worrying and more energy on thoughtful response, to find peace more readily because we're not constantly fighting battles we cannot win. Marcus Aurelius believed that the universe is rational and orderly, that everything happens according to natural law, and that our suffering comes primarily from resisting this natural order rather than accepting it. He saw himself as part of the cosmos, connected to all other beings through shared reason and shared participation in the universal nature, and this sense of connection helped him maintain perspective even when his personal circumstances were difficult. He would remind himself that he was just one small part of a much larger whole, that his life was brief and temporary, that the universe would continue long after he was gone, and that his task was simply to fulfill his role well, to be a good human being and a good emperor for whatever time he had, without demanding more than that or expecting permanent recognition or success. This cosmic perspective, this sense of being a temporary expression of universal nature rather than a separate, isolated individual, gave him a kind of peace that didn't depend on personal achievement or validation, because he saw his value as inherent in his participation in the larger whole rather than in his individual accomplishments or status. This perspective might seem to diminish human significance, making us seem small and unimportant, but the Stoics didn't experience it that way. Rather, they found dignity and peace in recognizing their place within the cosmos, understanding that they were part of something much larger and more enduring than their individual lives, connected to all other rational beings through their shared capacity for wisdom and virtue. Marcus Aurelius would remind himself that the same rational principle that governed the universe also lived within him, that his capacity capacity for reason was a spark of the divine fire that animated all things, and that by living rationally and virtuously, he was aligning himself with the fundamental nature of reality. This wasn't a cold or impersonal view, but rather a deeply meaningful one, because it suggested that living well, developing wisdom, practicing justice, showing courage, maintaining self-discipline, wasn't just a personal preference, but a kind of cosmic duty, a way of fulfilling one's true nature as a rational being and contributing to the order and harmony of the whole. In our own time, when many people feel isolated and disconnected, when we often experience ourselves as separate individuals competing with others for limited resources, this Stoic sense of connection and shared humanity can be deeply healing. We are not alone, not really. Even when we feel lonely, we are part of a vast web of human life that stretches back through countless generations and forward into an unknown future, connected to all other people through our shared capacity for reason and our common vulnerability to suffering, our universal need for care and connection, our collective participation in the mystery of existence. When we recognize this connection, this fundamental kinship with all other human beings, it becomes harder to hate or judge others harshly, easier to extend compassion and patience, more natural to contribute to the common good rather than focusing exclusively on personal advantage. Marcus Aurelius saw himself as part of a community, first his family, then Rome, then humanity as a whole, and finally the entire cosmos, and each of these expanding circles of connection reminded him of his obligations to others, and helped him maintain his commitment to justice and kindness, even when it would have been easier to act selfishly. This social dimension of Stoic philosophy is sometimes overlooked in favor of the emphasis on individual self-mastery, but it's essential to understanding the complete Stoic vision of a good life. The Stoics were not hermits or isolationists. They were deeply engaged in their communities, holding public office, teaching students, writing for others, participating in the social and political life of their time. They believed that human beings are naturally social creatures, that we are meant to live together and cooperate with each other, and that our individual flourishing is intertwined with the flourishing of our communities. Marcus Aurelius, as emperor, had the most public and socially engaged role imaginable, responsible for the well-being of millions of people, constantly making decisions that affected others, always aware of his obligations to the common good. His philosophical practice didn't take him away from these responsibilities, but rather helped him fulfill them more effectively, giving him the clarity and calm he needed to make difficult decisions, the patience to deal with opposition and criticism, the resilience to persevere through setbacks and challenges. For those of us who don't have such vast responsibilities, the principle remains the same. We are social beings with obligations to others, and our philosophical practice should support rather than replace our engagement with our communities and relationships. The goal is not to become emotionally detached or indifferent to others, but rather to engage with them more skillfully, with greater patience and wisdom, without being thrown off balance by their actions or dependent on their approval for our peace of mind. We can care deeply about others while recognizing that we cannot control them, can work diligently for good outcomes while accepting that we cannot guarantee success, can participate fully in life while maintaining an inner stillness that doesn't depend on external circumstances. This balanced engagement, neither attached nor detached, caring but not desperate, is the Stoic ideal, and Marcus Aurelius exemplified it in his dedication to Rome and his duties, even while maintaining his philosophical equanimity. As night deepens and consciousness begins to drift towards sleep, These philosophical reflections can accompany us into rest, not as problems to solve or lessons to memorize, but as gentle companions that help ease the transition from waking thought to sleeping peace. The practice of philosophy, as the Stoics understood it, was not separate from life, but woven throughout it, informing how they woke in the morning, how they engaged with the day's challenges, how they reviewed their actions in the evening, and how they prepared for sleep. Marcus Aurelius often reflected before sleep on the day that had passed, examining his choices and actions, noticing where he had acted according to his principles and where he had fallen short, not with harsh judgment but with honest assessment aimed at improvement. This evening practice of philosophical review helped him close each day with clarity, acknowledging what had happened without either pride or excessive regret, and preparing his mind for the rest that would restore him for the next day's challenges. We can adopt a similar practice, taking a few quiet moments before sleep to reflect on the day that has passed, noticing our choices and reactions, recognizing our patterns, gently noting where we might respond differently in the future, and then releasing it all, letting the day go, accepting that it is complete and cannot be changed, and allowing ourselves to rest. This review is not about perfection or harsh self-criticism, but about honest self-awareness, about gradually learning the patterns of our own minds so we can respond more skillfully over time. The Stoics believed in the possibility of progress, in the gradual improvement of character through consistent practice, and Marcus Aurelius himself, despite decades of philosophical study and a lifetime of trying to live according to Stoic principles, never claimed to have achieved perfection. He saw himself as a student of philosophy, always learning, always working to align his actions more closely with his values, always aware of his shortcomings while committed to improving. This humility, this recognition that wisdom is a lifetime pursuit rather than a destination to reach, makes Stoic philosophy accessible and encouraging rather than intimidating or discouraging. The promise of Stoicism is not that we will become perfect, superhuman beings who never feel disturbed or challenged, but rather that we can gradually develop greater wisdom, resilience, and peace through consistent practice of philosophical principles. We will still face difficulties, still experience loss and disappointment, still feel pain and grief when circumstances hurt us, but we can learn to meet these experiences differently, with greater acceptance and less resistance, with more understanding and less blame, with clearer seeing and less distorted judgment. Over time, through patient repetition of key practices, examining our judgments, distinguishing what we control from what we don't, focusing on developing virtue rather than chasing external goods, accepting impermanence and change, we can become less reactive, less anxious, more present, more peaceful. The transformation is gradual and often invisible in the moment, but over months and years we may notice that things that once disturbed us greatly now barely register that we have developed. Reserves of calm we didn't know we possessed, that we can face challenges with a steadiness that surprises us. This is the promise that Marcus Aurelius lived and that his meditations offer to us, that inner peace is achievable not through perfect circumstances, but through philosophical understanding and practice, not by controlling the external world, but by taking responsibility for our internal world, not by eliminating all difficulty, but by changing our relationship to difficulty. The peace he found was not fragile or conditional, dependent on everything going his way, but rather robust and enduring, able to persist through war and plague and loss and betrayal. grounded in his understanding of what truly matters and what is truly within his power. He couldn't control whether Rome remained strong, or whether his reforms succeeded, or whether people appreciated his efforts, but he could control whether he acted with integrity, whether he treated people justly, whether he maintained his commitment to virtue, regardless of outcomes. And in focusing on what he could control, in accepting what he couldn't, in developing his character rather than chasing external validation, he found a peace that external circumstances could not disturb. In the quiet darkness of night, as thoughts slow and the boundaries of self soften, we can rest in this same understanding, this same recognition that peace is always available if we know where to look for it, not out there in the world of circumstances and other people's choices, but here in the domain of our own minds and hearts, in our capacity to see clearly and respond wisely, in our ability to accept reality and work skillfully within it, in our commitment to virtue, regardless of whether the world rewards that commitment. This is the Stoic path, the way Marcus Aurelius walked through his challenging life, and the invitation his meditations extend to us across the centuries, to find freedom, not through controlling everything, but through accepting what cannot be controlled, to find happiness, not through external success, but through internal virtue, to find peace, not through the elimination of difficulty, but through the transformation of how we meet difficulty. The night offers us this space of philosophical rest, this opportunity to step back from the urgency of daily life and reconnect with deeper truths, to remember what matters beneath all the surface concerns, to touch again that place of inner calm that exists always, waiting beneath our anxious striving. Marcus Aurelius found this place in his nightly meditations, in his private conversations with himself about how to live well, how to maintain virtue, how to fulfill his duties with excellence, while preserving his philosophical peace. He didn't separate his philosophy from his life, but used it as a constant guide and support, returning to it again and again, reminding himself of fundamental principles whenever he felt disturbed or uncertain, trusting that the wisdom of the Stoics, refined over generations of philosophical practice, could help him navigate whatever challenges arose. We can draw on this same wisdom, this same philosophical tradition, as we face our own challenges and seek our own peace. The circumstances of our lives are vastly different from those of a Roman emperor, but the fundamental human questions remain the same. How can I live well? How can I find peace amid difficulty? How can I maintain my integrity when circumstances pressure me to compromise? How can I develop wisdom and virtue? How can I accept what I cannot change while still working diligently for good outcomes? These are the questions Marcus Aurelius grappled with, the questions Stoic philosophy addresses, and the questions that each of us must answer for ourselves as we navigate our own lives. The answers the Stoics offer focus on what you control, develop virtue, accept impermanence, see things clearly without distorting judgment, maintain your principles, regardless of outcomes. These answers remain as relevant and practical now as they were 2,000 years ago, because human nature hasn't fundamentally changed. The basic structure of human life and its challenges hasn't fundamentally changed, and the path to wisdom and peace hasn't fundamentally changed. What has changed is the external circumstances, the particular forms that life's challenges take, the specific ways that the universal human predicament manifests in our particular time and place. But beneath all the surface differences, we face the same essential challenges that Marcus Aurelius faced: how to live with integrity in a complex world, how to maintain inner peace when external circumstances are turbulent, how to do good work without controlling outcomes, how to love others without being dependent on their responses, how to accept loss and change without being destroyed by them, how to find meaning and purpose in a temporary existence, how to live fully while knowing we will die. These are the eternal human questions, and Stoic philosophy, as embodied in the life and writings of Marcus Aurelius, offers time-tested wisdom for addressing them. In the peaceful dark of night, when the world outside is quiet and the internal chatter of the day begins to settle, we can let these philosophical themes work on us without forcing or grasping, allowing the wisdom of Marcus Aurelius to seep into our consciousness, not as abstract ideas, but as lived possibilities, as invitations to experience our lives differently. We don't need to memorize his writings or master Stoic terminology. We simply need to let the basic insights touch us, that peace comes from within rather than from without, that we have more control over our experience than we usually realize, because we can influence our judgments and responses even when we cannot control events. That virtue is its own reward and provides a foundation for happiness that external fortune cannot shake. That accepting reality as it is rather than as we wish it were is the beginning of wisdom, that we are part of something larger than ourselves and our individual concerns, that life is brief and precious, and the present moment is all we ever truly have. These truths, simple as they may sound when stated directly, contain within them the seeds of transformation, the potential for a fundamentally different relationship with life and its challenges. Marcus Aurelius discovered this transformation through years of dedicated philosophical practice, and his meditations offer us a window into his inner world, showing us how philosophy worked in the life of someone who faced extreme challenges while maintaining remarkable equanimity. He wasn't superhuman or blessed with easy circumstances. He was a person like us, subject to fear and frustration and disappointment and pain, capable of anger and pettiness and all the other common human failings. But he worked consistently to notice these reactions, to examine them, to question whether they were helpful or necessary, to redirect his mind toward more constructive patterns, and over time this work bore fruit, creating in him a stability and wisdom that served him well, and that has inspired countless readers ever since. The invitation his writings extend is not to be exactly like him, or to face life exactly as he did, but rather to engage in our own philosophical practice, to examine our own minds, to question our own judgments, to develop our own wisdom and virtue in ways appropriate to our own lives and circumstances. The specific content of our lives differs from his. We don't rule empires, command armies, or face the particular challenges he faced, but the underlying principles of how to live well remain constant and universally applicable. We can learn from his example, from his consistent return to philosophical principles, from his willingness to examine himself honestly, from his commitment to virtue regardless of outcomes, from his acceptance of what he could not control, from his focus on the present moment and his duties within it, from his cosmic perspective that helped him see his individual concerns in the context of the vast whole. As we rest in the stillness of night, allowing these reflections to accompany us toward sleep, we might notice a subtle shift in how we're holding our own lives, a gentler quality to our self-talk, a softer relationship to our concerns and worries. This is the beginning of philosophical practice, this slight shift in perspective that creates a little more space around our thoughts and feelings, allowing them to be present without overwhelming us, acknowledging difficulty without being destroyed by it. Marcus Aurelius cultivated this spacious awareness through his daily meditations, creating mental distance from his immediate reactions so he could respond with wisdom rather than reflex. And we can develop this same quality through consistent practice, gently noticing our thoughts without being completely identified with them, observing our emotions without being completely swept away by them, recognizing our preferences without insisting that reality conform to them. This practice of inner observation, of creating space between stimulus and response, between event and reaction, is perhaps the most practical gift that Stoic philosophy offers, because it gives us access to our own capacity for wisdom and choice, rather than leaving us at the mercy of automatic patterns. When something happens, someone criticizes us, a plan falls through, we receive disappointing news, our immediate reaction might be emotional and reactive, springing from habit and conditioning rather than from careful thought. But if we can pause, even briefly, if we can notice that reaction without immediately acting on it, we create an opportunity for wisdom to emerge, for a more thoughtful response to arise. We can ask ourselves, what am I telling myself about this situation? Is my interpretation accurate, or am I adding unnecessary drama? What would a wise person do here? What response aligns with my values? What is actually within my control? These questions, which Marcus Aurelius asked himself constantly, open up space for choice and wisdom, where previously there was only automatic reaction. This capacity to pause and reflect, to respond rather than merely react, grows stronger with practice, becoming more natural and accessible over time. At first, it may seem difficult or artificial, requiring significant effort to interrupt our automatic patterns and insert conscious reflection. But gradually, as we practice consistently, this reflective awareness becomes more integrated into our way of being, arising more naturally and requiring less deliberate effort. We begin to catch ourselves earlier in the process of reaction, noticing our judgments before they've fully formed, questioning our interpretations before they've solidified into fixed positions, creating space for wisdom before we've already committed to an unwise response. This is the fruit of philosophical practice, this gradual development of wisdom and self-awareness that serves us in countless situations throughout our lives. Marcus Aurelius never claimed to have perfected this practice, and his meditations show him repeatedly reminding himself of the same principles, suggesting that he too found it challenging to maintain philosophical perspective consistently. But he persevered, knowing that the work was worthwhile, even if perfection was impossible, that becoming a little wiser and more virtuous was worth the effort, even if complete transformation was beyond reach. This realistic humility about the philosophical path makes it more accessible and less intimidating, because we don't need to be perfect or achieve complete mastery. We simply need to keep practicing, keep returning to the principles that guide us, keep noticing when we've strayed, and gently redirecting ourselves. The path itself is the practice, and progress comes not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through consistent small efforts repeated over time. In the quiet of night, this long view of philosophical development can bring comfort and patience with ourselves, recognizing that we are works in progress, that wisdom accumulates gradually through experience and reflection, that setbacks and failures are part of the learning process rather than signs that we should give up. Marcus Aurelius faced countless setbacks and frustrations, dealt with problems that had no good solutions, made decisions that didn't work out as he'd hoped, experienced loss and disappointment and the failure of his efforts. But he didn't let these challenges destroy his peace or his commitment to philosophy. Instead, he used them as opportunities to practice his principles, to test his understanding, to deepen his wisdom. Every difficulty became a chance to practice acceptance, to distinguish what he could control from what he couldn't, to respond with virtue rather than despair. And this practice, repeated through thousands of challenging situations over decades of life, gradually forged in him a remarkable strength and stability that serves as an inspiration to all who encounter his writings. The strength that comes from philosophical practice is different from the strength that comes from willpower or determination alone, because it's based on understanding rather than mere effort, on acceptance rather than control, on working with reality rather than against it. When we understand clearly what we can and cannot control, we stop wasting energy fighting unwinnable battles and instead direct our efforts toward what is actually within our influence. When we accept impermanence and change as fundamental features of existence, we stop expecting things to stay the same and instead learn to flow with circumstances as they shift. When we develop virtue as our primary goal, we stop being dependent on external outcomes for our sense of success and instead find satisfaction in acting according to our principles regardless of results. These understandings, when deeply internalized through consistent practice, create a foundation for peace and resilience that doesn't depend on favorable circumstances but can persist through any conditions. This is the peace that Marcus Aurelius found and that Stoic philosophy promises to all who practice it sincerely. Not the peace of easy circumstances, but the peace of philosophical understanding. Not the happiness that comes from getting what we want, but the happiness that comes from wanting what we have, from accepting reality as it is, from focusing on what matters, from developing our character regardless of external validation. It is a deep and durable peace, one that can coexist with difficulty and pain, one that doesn't require the elimination of all challenges, but only a change in how we relate to challenges, how we understand them, how we meet them. And it is available to any of us who are willing to engage in the practice, to examine our minds, to question our judgments, to develop our capacity for wisdom and virtue. As thoughts become slower and more dreamlike, as consciousness begins the natural drift toward sleep, we can rest in the awareness that this philosophical practice is not something we must accomplish tonight or perfect quickly, but rather a lifelong companion, a way of approaching life that can support us through all its phases and challenges. Marcus Aurelius practiced his philosophy from youth until his death at age 58, and he never stopped learning, never stopped reminding himself of basic principles, never stopped working to align his actions with his values. His meditations, written in the last decade of his life, show him still grappling with the same fundamental challenges, still needing to remind himself to focus on what he could control, to accept what he couldn't, to maintain his virtue regardless of circumstances. This continued need for philosophical practice, even after decades of study, is not a failure, but rather a recognition that wisdom is not a permanent state to achieve, but a practice to maintain, that the mind naturally drifts and requires gentle redirection, that we are always works in progress rather than finished products. This long view of philosophical development can help us be patient and gentle with ourselves, recognizing that we don't need to transform overnight or achieve immediate mastery, that small, consistent efforts over time will gradually bear fruit, that progress is often invisible in the moment, but becomes clear when we look back over months and years and notice how we've changed. The person we are becoming through philosophical practice emerges slowly, through countless small choices and repeated returns to our principles, through consistent, gentle correction of our thoughts and judgments, through patient cultivation of wisdom and virtue in the midst of ordinary life. There is no destination to reach where we can stop practicing, no point at which we become so wise that we no longer need philosophical guidance. But this ongoing nature of the practice is part of its value, because it means we always have something constructive to work on, always have a way to engage meaningfully with whatever life brings. Marcus Aurelius found deep satisfaction in this philosophical work, in the daily practice of examining his mind and aligning his actions with his values, in the gradual development of wisdom and virtue that he could sense even if he couldn't fully measure it. He knew he was becoming a better person through his philosophical practice, developing qualities of patience, justice, wisdom, and courage that served him well in his duties and relationships. And this knowledge provided a kind of satisfaction that didn't depend on external recognition or validation. He wasn't practicing philosophy to impress others or to achieve fame as a philosopher, but simply to live better, to fulfill his potential as a rational being, to contribute positively to the world during his brief time in it. And this simple, sincere motivation, this commitment to becoming a better person, regardless of external rewards, is perhaps the most authentic and sustainable form of philosophical practice, because it doesn't depend on others' approval or on achieving some external standard, but only on our own sincere effort and the natural satisfaction that comes from living in accordance with our deepest values. In the peaceful darkness, as sleep approaches and the day's concerns fade into the background, we can connect with this same motivation, this simple desire to live well and become wiser, this commitment to philosophical practice, not because it's impressive or because others expect it, but because it makes our lives better, helps us navigate challenges more skillfully, develops qualities we value, and provides a foundation for lasting peace. This motivation, when kept simple and sincere, can sustain us through years of practice, through periods of apparent progress and periods of seeming stagnation, through times when philosophy feels easy and natural and times when it feels difficult and forced. The practice itself, the consistent return to examination and reflection and gentle correction, is what matters, and the fruits of the practice emerge in their own time without being forced. Marcus Aurelius understood that wisdom cannot be rushed or forced, but only cultivated patiently through consistent practice and honest self-examination, and his meditations reflect this understanding in their repetitive circling around key themes, their patient restatement of fundamental principles, their gentle reminders rather than harsh commands. He was writing to himself, not to impress readers or establish his philosophical credentials, and this private quality of his writing gives it an authenticity and accessibility that more polished philosophical works sometimes lack. We feel we are glimpsing his actual inner life, his real struggles and insights, his genuine attempts to live according to his principles, and this glimpse makes his philosophy feel more approachable and applicable to our own lives, because we see that he too faced difficulties. He too had to work at maintaining his philosophical perspective. He too needed regular reminding of basic truths. This human quality of Marcus Aurelius's philosophy, its roots in real struggle and sincere practice, rather than abstract theorizing, makes it particularly valuable for those of us who are trying to apply philosophy to actual life, rather than simply study it as an academic subject. We don't need perfect understanding or complete mastery of Stoic theory. We need practical wisdom that helps us respond to real situations, and Marcus Aurelius offers us exactly that. The distilled insights of someone who lived philosophy rather than merely teaching it, who tested Stoic principles in the most challenging circumstances imaginable and found them sound. His endorsement of these principles through his life and writings carries weight because he wasn't a sheltered academic, but a person deeply engaged with the world, facing pressures and responsibilities that would have overwhelmed most people, yet maintaining his philosophical practice and his inner peace through it all. As we rest in the gentle dark, allowing sleep to come in its own time, we can let this long reflection on Marcus Aurelius and inner calm settle into our consciousness, not as information to remember or lessons to apply tomorrow, but as a kind of philosophical atmosphere that can subtly influence how we experience our lives, making us perhaps a little more aware of our judgments, a little more willing to question our automatic reactions, a little more committed to focusing on what we can control rather than worrying about what we can't, a little more accepting of reality as it is rather than as we wish it were. These small shifts, barely noticeable in any given moment, accumulate over time into genuine transformation, into a different quality of life that is more peaceful and more aligned with our deepest values. The promise of Stoic philosophy, as embodied in the life and writings of Marcus Aurelius, is that this transformation is possible for anyone willing to engage in the practice, that inner calm is achievable not through perfect circumstances, but through philosophical understanding, that wisdom can be developed through consistent effort and honest self-examination, that virtue can be cultivated regardless of our starting point or current challenges. We don't need to be emperors or philosophers by profession. We simply need to be sincere in our commitment to living well, to examining ourselves honestly, to developing our capacity for wisdom and virtue. The path is simple, even if not always easy, and it remains open to all who wish to walk it, offering a way forward through any difficulty, a source of peace in any circumstance, a foundation for meaning and satisfaction that external fortune cannot shake. In this quiet space between waking and sleeping, between the day that has passed and the day that is yet to come, we can rest in the awareness that we are part of a long tradition of philosophical seekers, that Marcus Aurelius and countless others before and after him have walked this same path of inner development, that we are not alone in our struggles or our aspirations, that wisdom has been tested and refined across generations and found reliable. The principles that guided Marcus Aurelius through his challenging life can guide us through ours, not as rigid rules, but as flexible guidelines, not as absolute demands, but as helpful suggestions, not as requirements for perfection, but as supports for gradual improvement. And with this support, this philosophical inheritance from those who came before, we can face our own lives with greater confidence and peace, knowing that whatever challenges arise, we have resources to meet them, capacities to develop, principles to guide us. The night surrounds us with its quiet comfort, its invitation to release the day's struggles and rest in the simple fact of existence, of being here now, of breathing and feeling and experiencing this moment exactly as it is, without needing it to be different. This acceptance, this basic okayness with what is the foundation of Stoic peace, and it is always available to us if we can set aside our resistance and our demands for a moment and simply be with what is. Marcus Aurelius found this acceptance in his philosophical practice, this ability to meet reality without internal argument, to acknowledge what is without immediately moving to what should be, to experience the present moment fully without being pulled into past regrets or future anxieties. And this same acceptance is available to us here in the gentle dark, as thoughts slow and consciousness softens, as we release our grip on all the concerns and worries that filled the day and simply rest in the peace that is always present beneath our mental turbulence. This is the gift of night and the gift of philosophy, a chance to return to ourselves, to touch that place of inner calm that exists always, waiting beneath the surface, ready to support us if we can quiet down enough to notice it. Marcus Aurelius returned to this place regularly through his meditations, his private philosophical practice that kept him grounded and centered no matter what external chaos surrounded him. And we can develop our own practice, our own way of returning regularly to inner calm, of remembering what matters, of reconnecting with our deepest values and our capacity for wisdom. The specific form of the practice matters less than the sincerity of the commitment, the consistency of the effort, the gentleness of the return when we inevitably drift away. In the stillness of this moment, nothing is required of us except to be here, to breathe, to allow whatever is present to be present, to trust that rest will come in its own time, that wisdom will develop through its own process, that we are exactly where we need to be in our philosophical journey, even if it doesn't feel like we've made much progress. Marcus Aurelius would remind himself that every moment is a fresh start, that we can begin again right now regardless of what came before, that past failures don't determine future possibilities, that we are always free to choose wisdom and virtue in this present moment. This liberating recognition that we can always begin again, that we are not trapped by our past patterns or mistakes, provides hope and encouragement for the philosophical path, because it means we never fall so far that we cannot return. We never fail so completely that we cannot recommit to our principles. As sleep approaches, as the boundaries between thought and dream begin to blur, we can carry with us these philosophical insights, these ancient truths about inner calm and acceptance and virtue, letting them work in whatever mysterious ways the night allows, perhaps influencing our dreams, perhaps settling into our subconscious, perhaps simply providing a calm backdrop to our rest. The philosophy of Marcus Aurelius doesn't demand our constant conscious attention, but can work more subtly, shaping our perspective and responses in ways we may not immediately notice, but which gradually transform how we experience life. This subtle transformation, this gradual shift toward greater wisdom and peace, is the real fruit of philosophical practice, and it emerges not through dramatic effort, but through patient, consistent engagement with philosophical principles, through repeated gentle return to what matters when we drift into anxiety or resistance or distraction. The Roman emperor, writing by candlelight in his military tent nearly 2,000 years ago, could not have imagined the world we live in now with its technologies and complexities and particular challenges. But he understood deeply the human heart, the human mind, the fundamental challenges of being human in a world we cannot fully control, and his insights speak across the centuries to us in our very different circumstances, because human nature remains constant beneath all the surface changes. We still struggle with anxiety and fear, still face loss and disappointment, still wrestle with our own minds and emotions, still seek peace and meaning in the midst of difficulty. And the wisdom Marcus Aurelius offers still works, still provides genuine help and guidance, still points toward a peace that is achievable through philosophical practice and inner development rather than through control of external circumstances. This is the lasting gift of Stoic philosophy, and particularly of Marcus Aurelius's accessible, practical, deeply human meditations. They remind us that peace is possible, that wisdom can be developed, that virtue is its own reward, that we have far more control over our experience than we usually realize, because we can always choose our response even when we cannot choose our circumstances. These truths, simple but profound, can sustain us through any difficulty, can provide a foundation for peace in any situation, can guide us toward lives of greater wisdom and virtue and satisfaction. And as we rest in the quiet dark, allowing these truths to settle into consciousness, we participate in the same philosophical tradition that sustained Marcus Aurelius and countless others. We connect with wisdom that has been tested and proven across generations. We draw draw on resources far deeper and more reliable than our individual understanding. The night deepens, thoughts slow, consciousness drifts toward the rest that restores and renews, and in this gentle transition we can release all that we've been holding, all the concerns and worries and judgments that filled our minds, trusting that the new day will bring its own opportunities to practice wisdom, its own chances to develop virtue, its own situations in which we can choose acceptance over resistance, inner calm over anxious striving. For now, this moment, there is only rest, only the simple fact of breathing and being, only the peace that exists always beneath the surface turbulence of thought and emotion, and this peace, which Marcus Aurelius discovered through his philosophical practice, which the Stoics cultivated through their understanding of what we can and cannot control, remains available to us always, waiting patiently for us to quiet down enough to notice it, to release our grip on external concerns enough to feel it, to accept reality enough to rest in it. This is inner calm, not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of acceptance, not the elimination of challenges, but the transformation of how we meet them, not control over external events, but mastery over internal responses, not perfect circumstances, but philosophical understanding that allows peace regardless of circumstances. Marcus Aurelius found this calm in the midst of empire and warfare, plague and loss, political opposition and personal disappointment, and his example shows us that it is possible, that it is achievable, through philosophical practice, that it is worth the effort of daily return to fundamental principles. The calm, he found, is available to us as well, not as a distant goal requiring years of study, but as a present possibility requiring only a shift in perspective, a willingness to see clearly, a commitment to virtue over comfort, wisdom over convenience, acceptance over resistance. And as consciousness continues its gentle drift toward sleep, as thought becomes looser and less directed, as the day fully releases its hold and night claims its proper space, we rest in this philosophical understanding, this ancient wisdom about inner peace and acceptance and virtue, carried across centuries by words written in quiet hours by someone who understood deeply what it means to be human, to struggle, to seek peace, to find it not through control, but through acceptance, not through avoidance, but through understanding, not through changing the world, but through changing ourselves. This wisdom remains fresh and vital because it addresses something fundamental and unchanging in human experience, and it offers genuine help, genuine guidance, genuine hope that peace is possible even in difficulty, that wisdom can be developed even by those of us who are not philosophical by nature, that inner calm is achievable not through perfect circumstances, but through philosophical practice and the patient cultivation of virtue and acceptance. The Roman emperor has slept for nearly 2,000 years, but his words remain, his insights persist, his wisdom continues to guide those who encounter it sincerely. And in the quiet night we join that long lineage of philosophical seekers, resting in the same understanding that sustained him, drawing on the same ancient principles, participating in the same tradition of inner development. And with this connection, this sense of being part of something larger and more enduring than our individual lives, we can find both comfort and inspiration, both rest and resolve, both peace in the present moment and commitment to continuing the philosophical work in moments yet to come. For now, though, this moment, there is only rest, only gentle release, only the quiet certainty that we are held by something larger than ourselves, that wisdom supports us even when we're not consciously thinking about it, that inner calm is always available if we can remember to return to it. to notice it, to rest in it. And in this rest, this gentle allowing of sleep to come in its own time and way, we embody the philosophical principle that Marcus Aurelius practiced daily: acceptance of what is, trust in natural processes, release of the need to control, focus on what is ours to manage while releasing what is not. The sleep that comes is natural and restorative, requiring nothing from us except our willingness to stop efforting, to let go, to trust. And this same principle applies to the larger philosophical work. We do what we can, we practice consistently, we return gently when we drift, and then we trust the process. We allow wisdom to develop in its own time. We recognize that we cannot force transformation, but only create conditions in which it can naturally emerge. This trust, this willingness to work patiently without demanding immediate results, is itself a form of philosophical wisdom, a recognition that some things unfold according to their own nature and timeline and cannot be rushed. Marcus Aurelius understood this deeply, recognizing that his own philosophical development was a lifelong process, that wisdom accumulated gradually through experience and reflection, that virtue was cultivated through countless small choices rather than achieved in dramatic moments. And he remained committed to the practice, returning daily to his principles, examining his thoughts and actions, gently correcting his course when he strayed, maintaining his philosophical work even when progress seemed slow or invisible. This commitment, this patient persistence in philosophical practice, regardless of immediate results, is what eventually bears fruit, what gradually transforms us in ways we may not notice day to day, but which become clear over longer periods. The person we are becoming through consistent philosophical practice emerges slowly, naturally, inevitably, like a plant growing toward light, and we cannot force the process, but only provide what is needed, and then trust, remain patient, continue the practice. In the deep quiet of night, when all the day's striving has ceased and we simply exist in the darkness, breathing, being, gradually releasing into sleep, we rest in this understanding, this acceptance that transformation is a natural process that unfolds in its own time, that our work is simply to practice consistently and then trust, to examine ourselves honestly, and then be patient with what we discover, to commit to wisdom and virtue, and then allow those qualities to develop at their own pace. This patient trust, this willingness to work without demanding immediate visible results, is itself a philosophical achievement, a sign that we are learning to work with reality rather than against it, to accept natural processes rather than trying to force outcomes, to focus on what we can control, our effort and intention, while releasing what we cannot, the pace and visibility of results. And as sleep deepens, as consciousness fully releases the day and enters into rest and restoration, the philosophical themes that have accompanied us through this reflection settle into whatever mysterious place such ideas go when we're not actively thinking about them. Perhaps continuing to work in subtle ways, perhaps simply resting alongside us until we wake and begin again the daily practice of living philosophically, meeting life's challenges with the wisdom and principles we've been cultivating. Marcus Aurelius would wake each morning and remind himself of his philosophical commitments, preparing himself mentally for the day's challenges, recommitting to virtue and acceptance, and focus on what he could control. And we too can develop our own morning practice, our own way of beginning each day with philosophical intention, remembering what matters, committing to our principles, preparing ourselves to meet whatever arises with wisdom and equanimity rather than reactivity and resistance. But for now, this night, there is only rest, only the gentle dark and the quiet breath and the gradual release of all holding, all effort, all concern. Philosophy has served its purpose for today, providing perspective and peace, reminding us of what matters, helping us release what we cannot control and accept what is. Tomorrow will bring new opportunities to practice, new situations in which to apply philosophical principles, new challenges that will test and develop our wisdom. But tomorrow is not here yet, and the present moment asks only for rest, for the simple allowing of natural processes, for the trust that we will wake renewed and ready to continue the philosophical journey, one day at a time, one moment at a time, gradually becoming wiser and more virtuous through patient, consistent practice. And in this rest, this nighttime release from all the day's concerns and efforts, we touch something of what Marcus Aurelius found in his philosophical practice, a deep peace that doesn't depend on circumstances, an inner calm that persists regardless of external turbulence, a sense of being fundamentally okay even when life is difficult, of being aligned with something larger and more enduring than our personal concerns. This peace, this calm, this sense of fundamental okayness is always available, always waiting beneath the surface of our anxious striving, ready to support us when we can. Quiet down enough to notice it, to rest in it, to let it hold us. And tonight, in the gentle dark, we rest in this peace, we allow this calm, we trust this fundamental okayness, knowing that it will be here tomorrow as well, that it is not something we must earn or achieve, but simply something we can notice and accept and rest in whenever we remember to return to it. The philosophy of Marcus Aurelius, the wisdom of the Stoics, the practice of inner development, all of this points ultimately toward this simple truth. Peace is available now. Calm exists always beneath our mental turbulence. Wisdom is something we already possess in seed form and can cultivate through practice. Virtue is possible regardless of circumstances. Acceptance is always an option, and inner freedom is our birthright as rational beings. These truths may seem abstract when stated directly, but they become lived realities through consistent philosophical practice, through repeated gentle return to principles when we drift, through patient cultivation of wisdom and virtue in the midst of ordinary life. And over time, through this practice, we discover that what seemed like distant philosophical ideals are actually accessible possibilities, that inner calm is not something reserved for saints and sages, but available to anyone willing to do the work, that wisdom can be developed by ordinary people facing ordinary challenges if we're sincere in our commitment and patient in our practice. As consciousness drifts fully into sleep, as thought dissolves into the mysterious processes of rest and restoration, the philosophical work continues in its own way, settling into deeper layers of mind, perhaps influencing dreams, perhaps simply resting, waiting to emerge tomorrow in subtle shifts of perspective and response. The practice of philosophy is like this. Much of the work happens below the surface of consciousness, gradually reshaping our default patterns and automatic responses, slowly cultivating qualities we couldn't force into being through will alone, but which emerge naturally from consistent practice and sincere engagement with philosophical principles. We do our part through conscious practice and self-examination, and then we trust the process. We allow the work to unfold in its own way and time. We recognize that transformation is a natural consequence of consistent practice rather than something we can force or demand. And in this final drift into deep sleep, we can release even these philosophical reflections, setting aside all thinking and simply resting in the peaceful dark, trusting that the wisdom we've touched tonight will be available tomorrow, that the practice will continue, that we are held by something larger than our individual understanding, that inner calm is always available when we remember to return to it. The night holds us gently. Marcus Aurelius's wisdom accompanies us into rest, and the ancient principles of Stoic philosophy provide a foundation of peace that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances, but on philosophical understanding, on acceptance of reality, on focus on what we can control, on commitment to virtue regardless of outcomes. This is the path he walked, the peace he found, and the invitation his meditations extend to us across the centuries, to find our own inner calm through philosophical practice, to develop our own wisdom through consistent self-examination, to cultivate our own virtue through patient engagement with life's challenges. And now, in the deep quiet of night, we rest in this possibility, this promise, this ancient wisdom that remains as fresh and practical today as it was nearly 2,000 years ago, because human nature hasn't changed. The fundamental challenges of being human persist across time, and the path to wisdom and inner peace remains constant beneath all the surface variations. Marcus Aurelius found this path and followed it faithfully through his challenging life, and his example shows us that it is possible, that it is worthwhile, that inner calm is achievable not through perfect circumstances, but through philosophical understanding and practice. And with this knowledge, this encouragement, this connection to a long tradition of philosophical seekers, we rest, we release, we trust, we sleep, knowing that tomorrow brings new opportunities to practice, to grow, to become gradually wiser and more virtuous, to find our own way along the ancient path toward inner calm and lasting peace.